What's up, everybody? Today I'm going to be making a decorative carved leather box that I'm going to use to house my growing hoard of Viking jewelry, which as of today has an extra piece added to it. VKNGjewelry.com or VikingJewelry.com contacted me out of the blue and asked if I wanted to partner with them on a video. Obviously, I don't want to sell you guys a bunch of garbage, and I was pretty skeptical about what the quality of this bracelet would be, but I was pleasantly surprised when it got to me. So for the first 48 hours after the release of this video, you can use the coupon code DARKHORSE30 to get 30% off your purchase. And then following that, there'll be another coupon code, which you can find in the description of this video, that'll give you 20% off for the next month. So hopefully you can take advantage of that. As always, you can find the patterns and artwork from my builds on my Etsy shop, so there will be a link right here. You can also find the patterns and artwork from all my latest videos month to month on my Patreon. And if you're interested in helping support the channel even more, I've started designing some shirts. They're linked in the videos below. They're linked below. If you're looking for a project with limited tools, this may be the one for you guys. I tried to keep this as simple as possible. Obviously, there's got to be some tools, and if there's something you don't have that you want to pick up, you can always go over to my Amazon storefront, and I'll have all the tools listed there that you'll need for this project. Starting out is pretty simple. It's just 3 strips of leather of various widths, and a total of 4 circles. 3 that are the same size, 1 that is a little smaller. And to make things even easier, all the leather used in this project is 8-ounce Vegetan. So because we want the box to have as nice a seal as possible, I'm going to do a number 2 beveler on certain parts of this box. So the inside strip of the box will have a bevel on both sides. That way when the lid goes on, it goes on more smoothly. And the inside lip of the lid will also be beveled, so that, again, it goes on smoothly when it connects with the bottom part. I did end up using a very fine beveler on the edges that I didn't hit with the number 2. That's just to clean them up in case they didn't look perfectly smooth. Make sure your circles aren't too choppy because we're going to be mounting to the edge of them. You could always use a bench sander if you wanted to clean them up a little bit, but I ended up cutting them out pretty good, so I didn't have to touch them up with a sander. Now we finished cutting everything out and it's time to add some artwork. Obviously I'm going to keep this artwork with the pattern, so it'll be available if you purchase it through my Etsy shop. You can use something of your own or find some other pattern on my Etsy store if you like, so let's get going. I'm really trying to expand my skills as an artist and draw things that aren't serpents. So I'm drawing a wolf here. I think it's better than the last wolf I did. I'm pretty happy with it, so I'm just going to keep at it, keep practicing, and hopefully I get amazing at drawing Viking animals. So usually I would skip through this process a lot faster, but I was so proud of it that I'm going to just let it linger for a bit. When you guys get done this or jump ahead, we can move on to the next part. Inking your drawings is a great way to make them pop and take them to that next level. I love these Faber-Castell pens that I've been using, so I'll link them in my Amazon store as well. But if you haven't tried inking, I highly recommend it. You'll be incredibly surprised at how it transforms your artwork. Now that we're done with the inking, we have to pull the pattern from it. There we go. So now we've got our tracing film pattern and we can get ready to carve. You don't want your leather soggy, so make sure it dries a bit before you carve it. I just use a wing divider there to set the line for my circle part of this pattern. I wouldn't want to do it by eyeball with my hand or even with tracing film. It's much better to have a perfect circle because a circle that's not perfect is pretty glaring. So just take your time and make sure you've got a nice clean circle on that. So now that we've done the tracing of the image itself onto the leather through the tracing film, we're going to cut all our swivel knife cuts. It'll go pretty quick. Just be patient. It's a little tedious, but it's not difficult. You just got to be patient and make sure your leather is wet enough. You can see it slowly drying off here, but it's still definitely damp enough to get the knife cuts done. You could put it in a Ziploc bag and come back to it later to work on it. That's a good way of making sure it doesn't dry out. But I usually get everything done in the same day, so that's not necessary. But if you're doing a giant project, you could put the whole piece in a Ziploc bag. Now, before you dive in and just throw your project into a Ziploc bag, make sure that you investigate that process first, because I have never actually done it. I've just heard about it, so take it from me, do a little research. Now, as far as tedious goes, backgrounding isn't first for me. Beveling would probably be first, but it's still pretty tedious as well, so I am doing this at... What speed am I doing this at? 600%. So you can get an idea of how long it takes to do this by the fact that we're getting it done in 1/6 the amount of time. Now, those of you who have seen a bunch of videos of mine will notice that I'm not using any beveler stamp tool, and I'm not going to use any beveler stamp tool. This is how I used to do all my carvings. No beveling. Some of you probably just gasped, but I really did just do my line work and then do a crisp background, and it always looked really good. Now, recently I've done a lot more background beveling, and it adds a ton of time, but depending on your project, your time constraints, if you're doing 50 of these for friends as gifts, you may want to skip the beveling. I think the thing about beveling is a lot of the time, if it's done poorly, it does look really bad. If it's done well, it certainly makes your project look that much better. That's not to say that the beveling is overly complicated, but it's much more difficult to screw up your backgrounding than it is to screw up your beveling. This little rolling stamp tool from Tandy is a great way to add some accents to your projects without a lot of work. So maybe you want to look into that. I'll link it on my Amazon store. That's not the only design, there's a few different ones. Now, I've wet my carving down in order to apply the dye more evenly. I'm using a dark brown dye. I'm painting it on. It's going to get a little blotchy perhaps. Though the darker the dye is, the less likely it is to look blotchy. Here I'm using a number 2 beveler on the smaller circle that fits inside the box. I decided to dye this circle black. It doesn't have to be black, you can do whatever you want with it. After I put a few coats of black on it, I let it dry, then buff the surface a bit to remove any excess. Here I am pretending to use a fine beveler because I used it and it didn't record. So I'm hitting all these edges with the fine beveler just to clean them up a little bit. Again, not completely necessary. I wouldn't use a small beveler, I would use a fine or nothing. I've gotten a few comments from people saying, why don't you use a diamond punch? Why don't you use a diamond punch? Magnus, why don't you use a diamond punch? Well, here, I'm using a diamond punch. I finally picked some up so you guys could see it in use. You could totally use the 4-in-1 punch that you see in a lot of my videos, or you can find these over on my storefront. I have nothing bad to say about them. I've always tried to avoid hand stitching, so I never really dived into all the punches. These are great little punches. I really like them, and I liked how little the holes were. Now, I've decided to dye everything a light brown. I'm using the Pro Dye because I always use the Pro Dye, but more specifically, the Pro Dye doesn't really go on super strong. So the light brown will be really light, which is good for if it starts to get darker when I put finishes on it or gels on it and slowly darkens up. So I wanted to start with a really light base. You could also just dilute some regular Phoebing's dye, but just make sure you wet your piece before you wipe it on because it goes on a little streaky. The Pro Dye doesn't go on as streaky. Some people will think that this is pretty dark, but it certainly lightens up a ton when it dries. And yep, I'm even dyeing the backs of these. Here I am pretending to put a finish on this because it didn't record. Now I'm putting a finish on the rest of them. Now I'm going to hit the carving with an antique gel, so this finish is a resist, but I want to hit that gel on everything, so I want to put the finish on everything. So even though there's no carving on this. I'm going to hit it with the gel anyways to keep the color consistent, because there will be a little bit of color transfer even though you have a resist on your piece. Now I'm trying to be as careful as possible with certain aspects of this antique finish, because I don't want to get any on the backside, because you're going to see the backside. Usually I'm a bit of a mess with that stuff, and I'm trying to get a little better. So here my battery died, so I'm pretending to wipe the gel into all the cracks and background. Just make sure you use a fairly liberal amount, get it in everywhere, wipe away the excess. I'll put a link right here to another carving video just to make sure that you've got all your bases covered. After that, we're going to put a finish on top of everything to seal it in. I've used a Angelus matte finish for the resist on this project. I also used an Angelus matte finish for the final top coat on this project. I think I prefer neutral Resolene for a resist, but I definitely appreciate how the matte finish looks if I'm just putting a finish on something. I don't like stuff super glossy. So though I used a light brown for my dyeing process, I'm using a dark brown on the edges. I think a darker edge always looks better. It hides all those little imperfections, little tiny hairs that maybe don't get burnished down, etc. So once we've dyed all of our edges, we've buffed them up, we're going to put some wax on the edge and burnish it. There's a bunch of different kind of tools you can use to burnish your edges. I like a straight edge burnisher like this bone folder. There's rounded ones. There's all sorts of different options. Plastic. So try a few of them. Use what's best for you. You don't have to use wax. You can just use water. I'm always worried about it discoloring along where I've used the water. I'm probably overthinking things, so feel free to experiment a little bit. Or maybe some water with saddle soap. That'll work as well. Lots of different options. Again, it's just personal preference. I like the wax. So even edges that are not fully beveled, like this one here is straight, I'm still burnishing. So I burnish down the edge, and then I go over the top just to make sure I get rid of any warping. I do want to smooth out the edge, even though it's just got that fine little bevel, but I want to smooth it out flat. So here I'm doing both sides because I've beveled both sides. Bomb through that really quick, then just buff up the top to remove any marks. Now we're going to hand stitch together the two widest strips. We'll move through this pretty quick. I backstitch a little bit and burn both ends. Then of course I do the other strip as well. Now we get to see how good our ruler skills are and if everything measures up appropriately. Before you glue anything together, it's always good to do a little test. So here we are sliding the pieces over each other and fits perfectly. Great. It has to be able to show the edge, make sure they're not backwards, and we should be able to fit our bottom into it. Press down, and it's all done. Well, other than it'll fall apart if we move it, but that's the general idea. I'm going to use some leather weld here. I use contact cement a lot, but for this specific purpose, I want it to be a little forgiving and I want it to slide around easier. So we want to make sure our stitches are matched up. We want to make sure the leather weld isn't put on in excess, but it's on enough that we can make sure we have a good bond. Now, because of the placement of this glue, it's going to bond these two pieces together as well as the bottom, so it's going to help us. Now you're going to place your bottom piece in there, and just like we did on our test, we're going to flip it over and press it down, and that'll lock the bottom in place. Now I'm going to do the same thing to the bottom. I'm going to glue the black piece in. I'm using leather weld again because I want it to have a little bit of play. This isn't contact cement, so the glue that we used on the bottom obviously isn't perfectly set yet. If you use contact cement and it's not on perfectly, you're going to rip everything apart if you have to make any adjustments. Now for the top piece, I've decided to use contact cement. You could probably use white glue as well. Just let it set a bit. I'm not too worried about these matching up perfectly because they should match up perfectly. They're round. If you can't match these up perfectly, you just stick to white glue. But this does show us the flaws in our circles. There's bound to be some flaws, so I'm going to take it and cut off any little bits that I've noticed, and then I'm going to hit it with the sander. Now, if you know how to cut a circle better than me, you probably don't have to do any of this, and it'll fit perfectly. But obviously, I have some circle issues, so we got this done on the sander. I'm going to dye the edge, let it dry, and then I'm going to burnish the edge. I'm not putting wax on this edge because we're gluing it, so I'm burnishing it just to give it a little nice look. So this edge doesn't meet up perfectly. I stretch it out a bit. It's probably because of the dye. Who knows? or maybe because of the carving, it could have expanded the circle a little bit. So you just give it a stretch. I'm dyeing the inside edge so that when I glue the pieces together, you don't see that light inside edge. We're going to use contact cement because of just because of the placement, and I think it'll work out really well. Just be careful with your contact cement. Make sure you don't get it all over everything. Be very careful. And then it's really easy to put it on because you let the contact cement dry, and then you just kind of spin it onto it because it should line up perfectly. It's flat. Everything's flat. You just go around the edge. And then after you've brought it in with the contact cement, you can get around to stitching that final part of the box together. Just like before, snip and burn. I go around the edge once with my bone folder to make sure the glue is nice and tight. And then I'm just going to go around the top and the side a little bit to burnish everything slightly. Then remove any warps with my bone folder. Then do the same thing to the bottom. Don't be lazy with your projects. Make sure you do all those little finishing touches because they add up and make your project look that much better. Well, that's about it, everybody. I'd like to thank VKNGjewelry.com for sponsoring this video. I think that box turned out pretty cool. Hopefully you can get some kind of use out of the pattern on my Etsy shop or for a limited time on my Patreon. Make sure you like the video if you enjoyed it, subscribe for future videos, hit the notification button so you don't miss any of my content, and until next time, keep on being creative in whatever it is you do.